It was the summer of 1899, and the air in Selkirk, a small, stubborn town nestled deep in the Scottish borders, felt thick with more than just the usual midges and the scent of damp wool. I was only 10 years old then, a scrawny lad named Hamish, with knees that always seemed to be scraped and a mind that worried over things grown-ups dismissed as child's folly. But what happened that summer, what truly befell the 7 bonny sisters of Selkirk, was no folly. It was a darkness that swallowed light, a secret that clung to the very stones of our village, heavy and cold as a winter shroud. Our Selkirk was a place of routine and predictability. The river Ettrick carved its path through the valley, powering the mills that were the town's lifeblood. The days were marked by the clatter of looms, the bleating of sheep from the hills, and the distant, mournful whistle of the trains bound for Edinburgh. Sundays meant stiff collars and the long drone of Reverend McTavish's sermons. Everyone knew everyone, and a stranger was a curiosity, soon either welcomed or watched with a suspicious eye. It was not a place for mysteries, not for the kind that make your blood run cold and your heart hammer like a blacksmith's hammer. The Bonny Sisters, as they were affectionately, if somewhat predictably, known, lived in a grand, albeit slightly crumbling house on the outskirts of town, near the ancient gnarled oak that the old folk said had stood since the time of border reivers. Their surname was McLaren, and there were indeed 7 of them, a sight to behold, even for a boy like me who was more interested in chasing minnows in the burn. Elspeth, the eldest, was perhaps 25, with a serious face and hands always, busy with needlework. Then came Fiona, the lively one, her laughter often echoing through the cobblestone streets. Morag, quiet and observant, often sketching in a small notebook. Isabel, with hair the color of autumn leaves, who loved to read. And the 3 youngest, Kirsty, a boisterous 10-year-old like me, with a penchant for climbing trees. Agnes, sweet and timid, always clinging to Isabel's skirts. And finally, little Mary, no more than 5, a tiny sprite who seemed made of sunshine and dandelion fluff. Their parents, Mr. and Mrs. McLaren, were well respected. Mr. McLaren was a quiet, industrious man who managed one of the larger wool mills, and Mrs. McLaren, though often ailing with a persistent cough, was known for her kindness and her garden, which bloomed even when the rest of Selkirk's patches looked barren. They were a pillar of the community, their lives intertwined with the ebb and flow of our small world. The sisters were their pride and joy, educated beyond what was common for girls in those parts, capable of quoting Burns and discussing politics with the menfolk, yet equally skilled at baking and mending. They moved through Selkirk like a colorful flock of birds, their distinct personalities weaving together into a single, vibrant tapestry that was very much a part of our town's identity. My own family lived closer to the heart of Selkirk. My da working the looms and my ma patching up trousers and boiling potatoes. We didn't have much, but we had enough, and there was always a warm hearth and a story to be told around it. I spent most of my days exploring the edges of the Eildon Hills, imagining myself a great adventurer, or helping Da in the mill, fetching tools and sweeping up scraps of wool, but often my path would cross with one of the McLaren sisters. Fiona would give me a quick, mischievous wink as she passed, or Morag might pause to show me a drawing of a robin she'd seen. Kirsty, being my age, was the one I saw most, though she was usually with her sisters and I with my own friends, too shy to approach a girl. That summer, though, a peculiar shift began to settle over the McLaren house. It started subtly, a ripple, in the familiar patterns of Selkirk life. The sisters, usually out and about, running errands, visiting neighbors, or simply taking their evening strolls along the riverbank, seemed to become less visible. At first, no one thought much of. Mrs. McLaren's cough had worsened, and it was presumed the girls were staying closer to home tending to her. But then the absence grew more pronounced. Fiona's hearty laughter was no longer heard echoing from the baker's shop. Morag's distinct figure, often bent over a sketchbook by the old oak, was no longer a common sight. Even little Mary, who used to chase butterflies in the meadow across from our house, seemed to have vanished from her usual haunts. The townsfolk, in their slow, deliberate way, began to notice. Mrs. McGregor, who ran the draper's shop, remarked to my ma that Elspeth hadn't been in for her usual weekly purchase of lace. Old Mr. Henderson, the postman, scratched his head, saying he hadn't seen any of the girls out for their morning walks. Whispers, light as thistledown at first, began to drift through the market square. "Are the McLarens well?" someone would ask. Poor Mrs. McLaren. "Her cough must be truly bad," another would reply. But underneath the polite concern, a prickle of unease was starting to take root. I felt it too. I remember one particular afternoon playing with my friend Dougal by the burn. We usually saw Kirsty McLaren there, or Agnes and Mary. But the banks were empty, save for us and the buzzing dragonflies. Dougal, who was a year older and pretended to know everything, shrugged. "Probably too busy with their mum," he'd said, but even his voice lacked conviction. The air around the McLaren house, usually filled with the murmur of voices or the faint sound of music from their piano, now seemed unnervingly quiet. The windows, which usually glowed with a warm, inviting light in the evenings, were often dark. My ma, bless her heart, tried to make sense of it. She'd always been a practical woman, seeing reason where others saw shadows. "They're likely just keeping to themselves," she'd say, giving Mrs. McLaren her peace. But even she, after a few weeks of this unusual seclusion, started to look at the McLaren house with a furrow in her brow. One evening, after Da had come home from the mill, tired and smelling of lanolin, Ma mentioned it again. "I thought of calling on Mrs. McLaren today with a fresh loaf of bread, but the gate was shut, and it felt unwelcoming." Da just grunted, tired. Men, I'd learned, often found it easier to ignore things that didn't directly affect the looms or the fields. But I couldn't ignore it. The McLaren sisters were like a fixture, as much a part of Selkirk as the Mercat Cross or the ancient kirkyard. Their absence left a hollow space, a quiet that was louder than any noise. I started to take detours on my way to and from school, walking past their house, trying to catch a glimpse. A sound. Nothing. The curtains were always drawn. The garden, once a riot of color, seemed to droop, uncared for. A sense of wrongness, a cold certainty, began to grow in my small chest. It wasn't just illness keeping them inside. Something else was happening. Something that felt wrong. It was. Roughly 2 months after this quiet withdrawal began, sometime in late August, when the whispers turned to worried murmurs, and the murmurs to open discussion. Reverend McTavish, a man not prone to meddling in private affairs, finally paid a call to the McLaren residence. He returned with a grim face, saying only that Mr. McLaren had assured him all was well, that Mrs. McLaren was recovering, and the girls were simply occupied with household duties. But his tone lacked conviction, and his eyes, usually so steady, darted nervously. That night, a strong wind blew through Selkirk, rattling window panes and moaning down the chimneys. I lay in my bed, listening to it, and my thoughts drifted to the McLaren house, out there in the dark, silent and still. A strange unease filled me, a premonition, perhaps, of the terrible news that would break with the dawn. The kind of news that shreds the fabric of a peaceful town and leaves a gaping, unhealable wound. The quiet had been building, a silence before a storm, and I, Hamish, a mere boy, was about to witness the moment it truly broke. The 7 sisters of Selkirk, vibrant and full of life, had simply faded from public view, and no one, not even their own father, seemed able to offer a satisfactory explanation. The seed of a chilling secret had been planted, slowly germinating in the heart of our unsuspecting town. And it was about to burst forth, leaving behind only questions and an absence that would haunt us for generations. The very next morning, the bell in the Mercat Cross Tower, usually reserved for fire or grave news, began to toll, a slow, insistent clang that echoed through the valley and dragged everyone from their beds. My ma gasped, dropping the kettle. "Hamish, what in God's name?" she whispered, her face pale. Da, already pulling on his boots, rushed out. I followed, my heart pounding, a cold dread already seizing me. The source of the tolling was soon clear. A small crowd had gathered near the McLaren house, a silent, anxious cluster, their faces etched with confusion and fear. And standing on their porch, Mr. McLaren, his shoulders slumped, his face ashen, delivered the impossible truth. The words were simple, yet they struck our small community like a thunderbolt. "They're gone," he choked out, his voice hoarse with unshed tears. "All of them. My daughters. They've vanished." A collective gasp swept through the crowd, followed by a torrent of disbelieving whispers. Gone? How could 7 young women, from the eldest, Elspeth, a grown woman, to the youngest, little Mary, simply vanish from a locked house in the middle of a closely knit town? It was an unthinkable notion. The Selkirk constabulary, few in number, and accustomed to petty disputes and stray sheep, were immediately stumped. The days that followed the shocking announcement were a blur of bewildered grief and mounting terror. Selkirk, once so predictable, now felt as though a great shadow had fallen across it, chilling every corner. The Mercat Cross bell, which had told the dreadful news, now seemed to ring inside everyone's heads, a constant, low thrum of unease. Constable Fraser, bless his honest but limited heart, was utterly out of his depth. He was a man of the law in a town where the most serious crime was usually a sheep rustler or a pub brawl gone too far. This vanishing, this impossible act, stretched his understanding of the world to its breaking point. He interviewed Mr. McLaren countless times, his questions growing more desperate with each visit. Mr. McLaren, haggard and aged seemingly overnight, repeated the same story. He had woken that morning, gone to rouse his daughters for breakfast, and found their rooms empty. No open windows, no signs of struggle, no footprints in the soft earth of the garden, which had been damp with morning dew. The doors had been locked from the inside. It defied all logic, and the constable, scratching his balding head, could only mutter about the unnaturalness of it all. He sent telegrams to Edinburgh, requesting assistance from the city's more experienced detectives. But in 1899, communication was slow, and Selkirk felt a world away from the bustling capital. We waited, helpless, while the wind seemed to carry the very emptiness of the McLaren house throughout the valley. The town, meanwhile, became a hotbed of whispers and frantic speculation. At first there was genuine concern, a wave of collective sorrow for the McLarens. My ma, wiping tears from her eyes, insisted on leaving baskets of food at their gate, though they were rarely touched. But as days bled into weeks with no sign of the sisters and no new information emerged, the initial sympathy began to curdle into something colder. Suspicion. If they didn't run away and they weren't taken by force, then what else could it be? The most dreadful thought, unspoken but heavy in the air, was that the answer lay much closer to home. All eyes began to turn to Mr. McLaren. He was a quiet man, as I've said, always focused on his mill, perhaps a little too reserved for some of the town's more jovial folk. Now his reticence was seen as coldness, his grief as performative. Why did he not raise the alarm sooner? Mrs. Duncan, the baker's wife, a woman known for her sharp tongue, muttered to anyone who would listen. 2 months they were barely seen, and now they're gone? It doesn't sit right. My ma tried to defend him, reminding Mrs. Duncan of Mrs. McLaren's illness. He was caring for his wife, woman, and the girls were tending to her too. But the seeds of doubt had been sown, and they were growing fast in the fertile ground of fear and the unknown. I watched it all, a silent observer. The adults would speak in hushed tones, pausing whenever I entered the room, but I heard enough. They talked about Mr. McLaren's temper, which was rarely seen but rumored to be fierce when roused. They spoke of the family's finances, suggesting perhaps the girls had run off to Edinburgh for adventure or to escape some unseen trouble. But the idea of Elspeth, so proper, or timid Agnes, running away seemed absurd. And little Mary? No one truly believed a 5-year-old could simply vanish, of her own accord. The sheer number of them, 7 souls, made any simple explanation crumble. My own feelings were a tangled mess. Part of me, the adventurous boy, wanted to believe it was some grand, mysterious escape, a story for the ages. But another part, the part that had felt the chill around their house, knew it was something darker. I missed Kirsty, even though we didn't play together much. I wondered if she was scared, wherever she was. And I often thought of little Mary, that tiny bit of sunshine. What could have happened to her? I started my own secret investigation, driven by a boy's fierce curiosity and a desperate need to understand. I couldn't simply sit by. After school, instead of heading to the burn, I'd circle the McLaren house. It stood silent and oppressive, its windows like dark, unblinking eyes. The once vibrant garden was now overgrown, the flowers wilting, a testament to the lack of care. A faint, cloying scent sometimes drifted from it, a mix of damp earth and something indefinable, like old, forgotten potpourri. It wasn't a bad smell, just off. One afternoon, bolder than I usually was, I crept through the McLaren's side gate, which, surprisingly, was now ajar. It creaked eerily as I pushed it open. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. The garden path was choked with weeds, leading to the back door. I peered through the window. The kitchen was dark, the table still set with what looked like dusty teacups, as if a meal had been abandoned midway, days or weeks ago. A shiver ran down my spine. This wasn't just a quiet house, it was a stopped house. I looked around the back of the house, my eyes scanning for anything amiss. The ground was hard-packed clay near the door, then turned to a patch of untended grass. Nothing, no signs of struggle, no dragged marks. But then, as I circled the old oak tree near the property line, something caught my eye. Tucked into the rough bark, almost hidden by a clinging vine, was a small, intricately carved wooden bird. It was painted a faded blue, with tiny white specks for eyes. I recognized it instantly. Morag. Morag McLaren was known for her small, delicate wood carvings. She often left them in unexpected places, a secret signature of her quiet presence. Why was this here, half hidden, as if forgotten or dropped in haste? It seemed too small, too insignificant for the constable to notice, but to me, it felt like a silent cry. It didn't look like it had been dropped in a panic. Rather, it seemed placed, perhaps intentionally hidden. I didn't touch it. Something told me not to. I just stared at it. A tiny blue bird in the rough gray bark, a single point of color in the growing gloom. It was a clue, I felt sure. But to what? To a secret game? Or a desperate message? I decided then and there that I wouldn't tell the constable. He would probably dismiss it as a child's toy. But for me, it deepened the mystery, confirming that something was terribly wrong. Back in the village, the arrival of Detective Inspector Caldwell from Edinburgh did little to assuage the growing panic. He was a tall, stern man with a neatly trimmed beard and sharp, assessing eyes, a stark contrast to our amiable, bumbling Constable Fraser. He questioned Mr. McLaren again, more rigorously this time, for hours. He searched the house himself, more thoroughly than anyone before him, turning over furniture, examining floorboards, sifting through ashes in the hearth. Yet he too emerged with a grim face and no answers. "It's as if they walked through a solid wall," he'd muttered to Constable Fraser, a remark I overheard from my eavesdropping post near the baker's shop. The official lack of progress only stoked the fires of local speculation. The town was now truly divided. Some clung to the hope that the sisters had simply run off, perhaps to start new lives, though no one could fathom why all seven would do so, abandoning their ailing mother. Others, fueled by old wives' tales, whispered of a curse laid upon the McLaren family, perhaps by the fey folk of the Eildon Hills, or the spirits of those lost during the border rivers' brutal days. A small faction, those who always saw the worst in people, hinted darkly that Mr. McLaren himself was involved. After all, who else could make 7 people disappear from a locked house without a trace? The most chilling aspect remained the utter lack of evidence. No struggle, no broken locks, no discarded belongings outside the property. It was as if they had simply ceased to exist. Mrs. McLaren remained cloistered in her room, her illness worsening, cared for by a rotation of grim-faced neighbors who spoke of her with pity, but also a growing sense of avoidance. People found reasons not to visit the McLaren house, not to walk past it after dark. The very air around it felt heavy, laden with unspoken questions and the terrifying silence of absence. I often thought about the wooden bird. It felt like the only solid piece of evidence I had, yet its meaning remained elusive. It didn't point to where they went or how they left, but it was a quiet, insistent reminder that they had indeed been there, and then, inexplicably, they weren't. The mystery of the McLaren sisters was slowly but surely weaving itself into the very fabric of Selkirk, changing it from a quaint, ordinary town into a place haunted by an impossible vanishing, a chilling secret buried deep within its heart, waiting for a boy with scraped knees and a curious mind to stumble upon its truth. And as the autumn leaves began to turn crimson and gold, a stark contrast to the deepening gloom, the sense of dread in Selkirk only grew, a silent scream frozen in time since that fateful summer of 1899. We were all trapped in a riddle, and the answer, whatever it was, promised to be more terrifying than any of us could imagine. The chill of autumn truly settled over Selkirk, not just in the biting wind that swept down from the Eildon Hills, but deep within the hearts of its people. The initial shock of the McLaren sisters' vanishing had given way to a festering unease, a constant hum of unanswered questions that seemed to vibrate through the very cobblestones of the town. Detective Inspector Caldwell, for all his sharp eyes and meticulous methods, was as stumped as our own Constable Fraser. He'd interviewed everyone connected to the McLarens, the mill workers, the shopkeepers, the few distant relatives who lived in neighboring villages. He'd even returned to the house, again and again, like a badger digging for a hidden scent, but always emerging with nothing but a grimace and a frustrated sigh. His presence, initially a comfort, now felt like a constant reminder of our helplessness. People stopped whispering about Mr. McLaren as much, not because they truly believed in his innocence, but because the lack of any actual evidence against him was maddening. Instead, the whispers turned to the house itself. Locals began to avoid the lane leading to the McLaren estate, especially after dusk. Children were warned away, their parents filling their heads with stories of curses and malevolent spirits, though my ma, ever the pragmatist, still tried to reason them out of it. "It's just an empty house, Hamish," she'd say, "and an unhappy one, nothing more." But I knew better. The bluebird Morag had carved, still hidden in the bark of the old oak, was a testament to something more. My secret investigation continued, driven by a gnawing curiosity and a sense of responsibility that no 10-year-old should ever have to bear. The bluebird felt like my personal secret, a shared confidence with the vanished Morag. I visited it regularly, often in the late afternoon when the shadows were long and the risk of being seen by a townsfolk was minimal. I'd sit beneath the ancient oak just looking at the house, trying to imagine what happened. The silence that hung over the McLaren home was profound, a vacuum where laughter and conversation once echoed. The curtains remained drawn, the garden continued its slow surrender to weeds, and the faint, peculiar scent, like dusty flowers, and something else I couldn't place, still lingered on the breeze. One blustery afternoon, while everyone else was huddled indoors, I made my way to the McLaren house. The wind howled through the bare branches of the oak, making it sound like it was moaning. I found the side gate, which had been ajar before, now firmly closed but not locked. A small detail, perhaps, but it made me wonder. Had someone been there? Recently? The inspector, perhaps? Or someone else? I slipped through, keeping close to the overgrown hedge. This time, I decided to focus on the periphery, the less obvious places the inspector might have overlooked in his systematic search. I walked around the back, past the kitchen window, and towards the small, dilapidated shed where Mr. McLaren kept his gardening tools. Its door was latched, but old and rusty. A gentle tug, and it creaked open, groaning like an old man. Inside, it was dark and musty, filled with the familiar smells of earth and old metal. Shovels, rakes, and a coil of worn rope hung from pegs. But on the dirt floor, tucked away behind a stack of empty terracotta pots, I saw something that made my breath catch. It was a small, well-worn wooden chest about the size of a shoebox with intricate carvings on its lid, not like Morag's delicate birds, but something older, more geometric, almost Celtic. It looked out of place amongst the rusty tools and cobwebs. My heart pounded. I knelt, pushing aside the pots, and reached for it. It was surprisingly heavy. The latch was simple, unfastened. With trembling fingers, I lifted the lid. Inside, nestled amongst layers of faded velvet, lay not treasure, but secrets. There were several small, leather-bound journals tied with delicate silk ribbons, a few loose, dried flowers pressed almost flat, and a small, tarnished silver locket. My eyes fixed on the journals. They looked like the kind of notebooks Morag carried, but these were older, the leather cracked with age. I carefully picked one up. It was Elspeth's, the eldest sister. Her neat, elegant handwriting filled the pages. I didn't dare read them there, not in the gloomy shed, my imagination already running wild. I carefully closed the box, tucked it under my arm, and quickly, quietly, slipped out of the shed, relatching the door as best I could. I hurried home, my heart a drumbeat in my ears, the weight of the chest a thrilling burden. I knew, with a certainty that only a boy obsessed with a mystery can feel, that this was important. This was the piece of the puzzle no one else had found. Back in the safety of my own small bedroom, the door firmly shut, I opened the chest again. I chose the oldest-looking journal, the one marked with Elspeth's name, and the year 1895. The pages smelled faintly of lavender and old paper. Her handwriting was beautiful, looping and precise. I began to read slowly, carefully, my young, eyes tracing each word. The entries started innocently enough, typical girlish musings about daily life, lessons, visits from neighbors, the weather. But then, as the pages turned, a subtle shift began. Elspeth wrote of her mother's worsening cough, a cough that no doctor in Selkirk seemed able to cure. She wrote of Mrs. McLaren's growing frailty, and then, more unsettlingly, of Mr. McLaren's increasing preoccupation. He was spending more and more time locked in his study, poring over old books, muttering to himself. He grew withdrawn, his usual quietness transforming into a brooding silence. The atmosphere in the house, Elspeth described, became strained, heavy with an unspoken tension. Then came the peculiar details. Elspeth mentioned a new project her father had embarked upon, something he called his studies in preservation. She wrote of strange concoctions brewing in the kitchen, of noxious fumes that made her sisters cough, and of their mother's condition strangely fluctuating. Moments of seeming improvement, followed by alarming regressions. There were references to ancient texts and unorthodox methods. Mr. McLaren, she wrote, believed he had found a way to hold back the tide of decay, to ward off the final sleep. My young mind struggled to fully grasp the implications of these words, but the unease they evoked was palpable. The entries became more urgent, more fearful. Elspeth wrote of her father's growing obsession, how he forbade the girls from leaving the house, citing their mother's delicate health as the reason. He began to administer daily tonics to Mrs. McLaren, tonics that Elspeth suspected were not of conventional medicine. She described how her mother, once vibrant, became increasingly listless, her skin developing an unnatural pallor. The other sisters, particularly Fiona and Morag, began to question their father's actions, but he would brook no dissent, his temper flaring, his eyes growing strangely bright, almost feverish. What truly sent a shiver down my spine were the entries, describing the treatments Mr. McLaren began to administer to his wife. He would lock himself in her room for hours, and the girls would hear strange sounds, low chanting, the bubbling of liquids, sometimes a faint rhythmic thumping. Elspeth wrote of a recurring dream, or perhaps a waking nightmare, where her mother's eyes, usually warm and kind, would stare at her with an unsettling emptiness. "He is trying to save her," Elspeth had written in one entry, her hand shaking on the page. But at what cost? The entries grew sporadic, filled with a mounting sense of fear and desperation. The outside world, our bustling Selkirk, seemed to shrink and disappear from the pages as the McLaren house became a prison. The last entry in Elspeth's journal, dated just a few days before the sisters' vanishing, was barely legible, a frantic scrawl. The smell. It is stronger now, sweet yet sickly. Father says it is the essence of life, distilled. Mother, she barely moves. And the others, they are changing. Fiona, so spirited, now so quiet. Morag, her hands shake. He insists we must all partake. For the preservation, we must be pure, untouched by the world's decay. He says we will be together forever in a new way. Oh God, what has he done? I closed the journal, my hands clammy. The words echoed in my head. The smell, sweet, yet sickly. It was the same scent I had noticed lingering around the McLaren house, the one I couldn't quite place. He says we will be together, forever, in a new way. What did that mean? Preservation, distilled essence of life. My young mind reeled, trying to connect these ominous phrases with the impossible disappearance. It wasn't fey folk or a curse. It was something far more terrifying, more human, yet utterly monstrous. I looked at the other journals in the chest. There were two more, one clearly Morag's and another, smaller one, perhaps Isabel's. I knew I had to read them to find more pieces of this horrifying puzzle. The silver locket lay there too, tarnished and seemingly insignificant. But I had a feeling it held its own small secret. This wasn't just a vanishing. This was a dark experiment, a twisted attempt at immortality, perhaps born of a father's. Desperate love and a brilliant mind gone terribly, terribly wrong. The secret of the 7 sisters of Selkirk was not buried. It was hidden in plain sight, recorded in the frantic scrawl of a frightened girl. And I, Hamish, was now holding the key to a truth that would shake Selkirk to its very foundations, a truth far more chilling than any ghost story.